Matchlocks." "I know. I've been here." "Well, could we make some kind of a deal?" Valkenhayn asked. A mendicant whine was beginning to creep into his voice. "I can get Garvin on screen, and switch him over to your ship." "Well, we have a lot of Sword World merchandise aboard," Harkonnen said. "We could make you good prices on some of it. How are you fixed for robotic equipment?" "But aren't you going to stay here?" Valkenhayn was almost in a panic. "Listen, suppose I talk to Garvin, and we all get together on this. Just excuse me for a minute." As soon as he had blanked out, Harkonnen threw back his head and guffawed, as though he had just heard the funniest and bawdiest joke in the galaxy. Trask himself didn't feel like laughing. "The humor escapes me," he admitted. "He came here on a fool's errand." "I'm sorry, Lucas." Harkonnen was still shaking with mirth. "I know it's a letdown, but that pair of chiseling chicken thieves, I could almost pity them if it weren't so funny." He laughed again. "You know what their idea was?" Trask shook his head. "Who are they?" "What I call them, a couple of chicken thieves. They raid planets like Set and Hertha and Melkarth, where the locals haven't anything to fight with, or anything worth fighting for. I didn't know they'd teamed up, but that figures. Nobody else would team up with either of them. What must have happened, this story of Duke Angus' Tanith adventure must have filtered out to them, and they thought that if they got here first, I'd think it was cheaper to take them in than run them out. I probably would have, too. They do have ships, of a sort, and they do raid, after a fashion. But now there isn't going to be any Tanith base, and they have a no-good planet and they're stuck with it." "Can't they make anything out of it themselves?" "Like what?" Harkonnen hooted. "They have no equipment, and they have no men, not for a job like that. The only thing they can do is space out and forget it." "We could sell them equipment." "We could, if they had anything to use for money. They haven't. One thing, we do want to let down and give the men a chance to walk on ground and look at a sky for a while. The girls here aren't too bad either," Harkonnen said. "As I remember, some of them even take a bath now and then." "That's the kind of news of Dunnan we're going to get. By the time we'd get to where he'd been reported, he'd be a couple of thousand light-years away," he said disgustedly. "I agree. We ought to give the men a chance to get off the ship here. We can stall this pair along for a while, and we won't have any trouble with them." The three ships were slowly converging toward a point 15,000 miles off-planet and over the sunset line. The space scourge bore the device of a mailed fist, clutching a comet by the head. It looked more like a whisk broom than a scourge. The Lamia bore a coiled snake with the head, arms, and bust of a woman. Valkenhayn and Spasso were taking their time about screening back, and he began to wonder if they weren't maneuvering the Nemesis into a cross-fire position. He mentioned this to Harkonnen and Alvin Carford. They both laughed. "Just holding ship's meetings," Carford said. "They'll be yakking back and forth for a couple of hours yet." "Yes, Valkenhayn and Spasso don't own their ships," Harkonnen explained. "They've gone in debt to their crews for supplies and maintenance till everybody owns everything in common. The ships look like it, too. They don't even command, really. They just preside over elected command councils." Finally, they had both of the more or less commanders on screen. Valkenhayn had zipped up his shirt and put on a jacket. Garvin Spasso was a small man, partly bald. His eyes were a shade too close together, and his thin mouth had a bitterly crafty twist. He began speaking at once. "Captain, Boak tells me you say you're not here in the service of the Duke of Wordshaven at all," he said aggrievedly. "That's correct," Harkonnen said. "We came here because Lord Trask thought another Graham ship, the Enterprise, would be here. Since she isn't, there's no point in our being here. We do hope, though, that you won't make any difficulty about our letting down and giving our men a couple of 100 hours liberty. They've been in hyperspace for 3,000 hours. See? Spasso clamored. He wants to trick us into letting him land. Captain Spasso, Trask cut in, will you please stop insulting everybody's intelligence, your own included? Spasso glared at him, belligerently but hopefully. I understand what you thought you were going to do here. You expected Captain Harkonnen here to establish a base for the Duke of Wardshaven. And you thought, if you were here ahead of him and in a posture of defense, that he'd take you into the Duke's service rather than waste ammunition and risk damage and casualties wiping you out. Well, I'm very sorry, gentlemen. Captain Harkonnen is in my service, and I'm not in the least interested in establishing a base on Tanith. Valkenhayn and Spasso looked at each other. At least, in the two side-by-side screens, their eyes shifted, each to the other's screen in his own ship. "I get it," Spasso cried suddenly. "There's two ships, the Enterprise and this one. The Duke of Wardshaven fitted out the Enterprise, and somebody else fitted out this one. They both want to put in a base here." That opened up a glorious vista. Instead of merely capitalizing on their nuisance value, they might find themselves holding the balance of power in a struggle for the planet. All sorts of profitable perfidies were possible. "Why, sure you can land, Otto," Valkenhayn said. "I know what it's like to be 3,000 hours in hyper myself." "You're at this old city, with the two tall tower buildings, aren't you?" Harkonnen asked. He looked up at the view screen. "Ought to be about midnight there now. How's the spaceport? When I was here, it was pretty bad." "Oh, we've been fixing it up. We've got a big gang of locals working for us." The city was familiar, from Otto Harkonnen's descriptions and from the pictures Van Larch had painted during the long jump from Graham. As they came in, it looked impressive, spreading for miles around the twin buildings that spired almost 3,000 feet above it, with a great spaceport like an 8-pointed star at one side. Whoever had built it, in the sunset splendor of the old Terran Federation, must have done so confident that it would have become a metropolis of a populous and prospering world. Then the sun of the Federation had gone down. Nobody knew what had happened on Tanith after that, but evidently none of it had been good. At first, the two towers seemed as sound as when they had been built. Gradually, it became apparent that one was broken at the top. For the most part, the smaller buildings scattered widely around them were standing, though here and there mounds of brush-grown rubble showed where some had fallen in. The spaceport looked good, a central octagon mass of buildings, the landing berths, and beyond, the triangular areas of airship docks and warehouses. The central building was outwardly intact, and the ship berths seemed clear of wreckage and rubble. By the time the Nemesis was following the Space Scourge and the Lamia down, towed by her own pinnaces, the illusion that they were approaching a living city had vanished. The interspaces between the buildings were choked with forest growth, broken by a few small fields and garden plots. At one time there had been 3 of the high buildings, literally vertical cities in themselves. Where the third had stood was a glazed crater, with a ridge of fallen rubble lying away from it. Somebody must have landed a medium missile, about 20 kilotons, against its base. Something of the same sort had scored on the far edge of the spaceport, and one of the 8 arrowheads of docks and warehouses was an indistinguishable slag pile. The rest of the city seemed to have died of neglect rather than violence. It certainly hadn't been bombed out. Harkonnen thought most of the fighting had been done with sub-neutron bombs or omega-ray bombs that killed people without damaging the real estate. Or bioweapons, a man-made plague that had gotten out of control and all but depopulated the planet. It takes an awful lot of people working together at an awful lot of jobs to keep a civilization running. Smash the installations and kill the top technicians and scientists, and the masses don't know how to rebuild, and go back to stone hatchets.